From the Lean Enterprise Institute in Boston, this is the WLEI podcast, where we share stories of people making the world better through lean thinking and practice. For more information about LEI, including how we can help you apply lean thinking, please visit lean.org.
Welcome to the Management Brief. This month, we're exploring problem solving at the corporate level with leaders trained in modern management practices. You could say these are MBAs turned consultants or Wall Streeters. And they've encountered lean thinking in ways that have been transformational. So today, Mark Reich and I are joined by Scott Heydon, former Vice President of Global Strategy at Starbucks. Scott played a key role in launching Starbucks Lean Transformation during the 2000s. Before that, he worked at McKinsey and Company, and he earned his MBA from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. I first met Scott when I was managing a Starbucks store in Portland, Oregon. At the time, Scott proposed a 4-store model line experiment to explore lean principles and practices at the retail level, and the store that I was managing happened to be selected. After the experiment showed real promise, Scott hired me onto a small lean team to help scale the effort across the company's global retail footprint. So today, I'm thrilled to reconnect and reflect on what we learned through that work and how it continues to shape our views on leadership, problem solving, and strategy. So thanks for being with us, Scott.
You bet. Great to be here.
So why don't you start off, just introduce yourself, give us an overview of your background and your experience with lean.
Sure. So I guess followed a fairly traditional kind of management track, I guess you could say. I worked for several years after college. Then I got my MBA, as you indicated, from Dartmouth. And then I joined McKinsey and was there for about 4 years. And after McKinsey, I joined Starbucks, initially in the role of strategy for North America, which became a global strategy function, which Starbucks didn't have at the time. And it was partway through that job at Starbucks that I was introduced to lean thinking, mostly because I wasn't in the room when a problem became visible and no one wanted to take it. And so I was assigned essentially the problem. And it was a process problem. I didn't really have any experience in solving process problems. And so I started researching in a very McKinsey way, maybe different approaches, and ultimately landed on lean thinking, mostly because of connections I found at the company after I started reading Jim Womack's book on lean thinking.
What were some of the kind of memorable or key lessons that you kind of took away from your experience in B school and your experience at McKinsey that really informed how you approached that strategy role when you got started with Starbucks?
So I'm not sure I'd say so much lessons, just maybe a way of approaching business problems. One of the great things I learned at McKinsey that has served me really well in life is a way to kind of break problems down. But yes, my not mine, but a framework I follow, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, MISI. But what I didn't really learn at McKinsey was how to fly below the, I don't know, 50,000 foot, 30,000 foot level, whatever you want to call it. And so coming into Starbucks, I thought I knew a lot about problem solving after doing it for 4 years at McKinsey. As I started learning more about lean thinking and about visiting stores more often and the problem stores had, I started learning that I didn't really know much about problem solving. And so I think more than key lessons, it was just a way of approaching problems, which was very MBA kind of oriented at a high level, using financials and analysis and maybe some surveys, things like that, to try to make recommendations and come to a conclusion, which is okay. It's not wrong, it's not bad, but it doesn't necessarily get as deep as it needs to go to really unlock a lot of value.
So that probably starts speaking to, I guess, what my next question is, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about how your thinking started to change or evolve once you began learning about lean, practicing lean, and ultimately leading the lean transformation at Starbucks.
Yeah, so probably the biggest shift for me was just, I guess there were two aspects of it. One was recognizing there was a lot going on in the ecosystem of work that I was oblivious previously had been oblivious to and wasn't really thinking about as I analyzed problems. And the other is just the role of engaging people as problem solvers and developing their problem solving capability. So I guess you could say, if you think about just as a simplistic level, kind of traditionally trying to come up with all the answers from corporate and pushing that down to, 8,000 stores across the US versus recognizing that all those stores are actually very different. Even my local store is different at 3 in the afternoon than it is at 7 in the morning. And so developing the capability to improve and to problem solve at the local level I became aware that that was actually the strategy. And there's John Shook and I used to, I don't know if joke's the right word, but talk about the big S strategy. Like, what market should we be in? What's our pricing strategy, product strategy, things like that. But then there's the little S strategy, which is how do we get better every day? And I think previously in my mind, and I think in most corporate minds, the answer starts with ideas from leaders at corporate as opposed to people closest to the work.
So how was it that some of that learning came about? I mean, maybe there are some pivotal moments, memorable experiences, perhaps that you can recall from maybe the early learning or just your learning throughout the sort of the lean transformation activity that really
Yeah, so one
shaped.
one thing I would say is I think just as a person, I have always been keenly focused on the customer. And I'm not sure I can totally explain that. Probably one piece I left out of my background is the week I turned 16, I went down to my local McDonald's and applied for a job. And so I spent 4 years kind of flipping burgers and serving customers and making French fries and doing that work and getting pretty good at it, finding better ways to do things. But that experience of being on the front lines, I think, really instilled for me the value of creating a good customer experience and good customer value. So that was my mindset, I think, throughout my entire career. But for me, probably the most pivotal experience was a day or two in stores. It feels like it was a day, but it might have been two, with a coach that John introduced me to, Jeff Smith. Just spending time with him in a store essentially forced me and taught me how to see the work in a new way. And it's really, I've struggled to try to describe that to people. The best analogy I've come up with is it's as if Jeff was sitting with me on a beach somewhere in the world and put a scuba diving outfit on me and took me under the water for the first time to see all of this life and these things that were occurring that I never was able to see before. And that was the details of the work. And the four-store test in Portland that had already started, just started actually. I think it was probably 2 weeks into that test, which was very kind of not entirely corporate-y, but programmatic, I guess I would say. That experience with Jeff kind of upended my thinking on how we should proceed at Starbucks, at least for Starbucks, by focusing more on the work and teaching people more about the work.
That's really interesting. So, Mark, I know you got some questions next, but just maybe a minute more on that. So, I mean, that four-store experiment, as I mentioned earlier, I was a part of it, and I remember the way that that got started, and then I remember it shifting in the approach in a pretty significant way, which it sounds like this experience with Jeff in stores was kind of instrumental in causing that shift or leading to that shift. Both of those were under the banner of lean. I mean, there was this lean experiment happening in Portland,
Yes.
but there really was a huge difference between kind of the approach, as you put it, programmatic approach that was taken at the beginning versus kind of where we ended up, even once we got beyond that four-store experiment and began to kind of spread or scale, as everybody likes to say, to more restaurants. Can you talk a little bit about like what made that initial approach in your view programmatic or corporate or even just kind of traditional, and then what changed in the new approach that was inspired by your experience with Jeff?
Well, so it was, I think programmatic is probably the right word. I'm not sure I'd call it corporate, because the intent of the original approach was to actually develop people's capabilities to improve. But maybe a small example of the difference is one of the early kind of programmatic lessons, I guess you could say, was about 5S. And I can't tell you how many leaders I talk to, and I think it's usually pretty clear to me they don't know a lot about lean when they bring up 5S as a priority. At Starbucks, depending on the store you visit, applying 5S principles to your shop may not be the biggest problem for you to solve. I mean, how does that directly impact the customer? And that experience with Jeff caused me to realize that there were more important problems to solve, like beverage quality, like excess motion, unnecessary burdensome motion, all the bending, the reaching, the lifting, that did more directly impact the customer. And so 5S by itself is not bad. There are times when it's needed. There are definitely environments where it creates problems. Someone every cycle or every 10th cycle has to search for a whole bunch of stuff because things are a mess. That's a real problem. That was not the case at that time in most shops at Starbucks. And so that might be a small example of how we went from this kind of, again, programmatic, let's teach them about 5S as one of several learnings, to let's teach them about how to improve the work.
I have a very specific anecdote, how I experienced that shift occurring in you, and then kind of how that got manifest. So as we said, I was part of that experiment, and I remember the first thing that we were introduced to was we called it workplace organization, or 5S. We were taught to do it, and then encouraged to do an exercise, and I went all out. Like it was on the one hand, to its credit, to the credit of that approach, I and my team got pretty fired up to organize our store and to sort out a bunch of stuff that we just weren't using and stuff like that. But almost all of our 5S energy went into organizing our back room.
Yes.
And I'll never forget, you showed up to see what we were up to and whatever. And I remember showing you, giving you a tour of the back room and all the organization that we had done. And you said some nice things and were encouraging and everything. And then you sort of like hit me with a gut punch with the question, so what problem is it that you're trying to solve? And I had no answer to it. In fact, there was a worksheet.
Ouch.
There was a worksheet that we were
Yeah.
encouraged to use to kind of document what we were doing. And to the credit of this worksheet, I guess there was a space there to answer the question, like what problem are you trying to solve, and then okay, like what's the current condition in terms of organization, and what are the changes that you're going to make. And when you looked at my worksheet, the section where I was prompted to specify the problem I was trying to solve was left blank. I didn't even know how to like engage with that question. What I could engage with was messy, clean.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so we kind of did that, but in terms of, as you say, in terms of like benefit to the customer or benefit to the business even, or whatever, there was no clarity around that, no connection really. I mean, it was just a more well-organized back room, which is fine.
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
And it could be helpful from a team member pride, I get more enjoyment out of my work. I won't, I don't remember that story. I apologize.
That's okay.
for hitting you with a gut punch, as you say. I do remember you telling me that when you generally finished your shift, you were so exhausted you had to go home and lie down for a little bit, just physically exhausted. That was a gut punch for me. And I think a big wake-up call, actually, because that felt like management wasn't being respectful of store teams. That notion had just been introduced to me by Mr. Smith. That also caused me to think about all and start to look for more, I think, all the burdensome work that existed at stores. And there was a lot. I will just say, I think it's fairly common. And again, it's not that these things aren't important, but certainly from my experience at Starbucks, other retailers, but even just non-retail, management generally looks for things that they can or can't see. Like, I have a standard of what I expect, and either the work site I'm visiting matches that standard or it doesn't. And often I hear people talk about problems as lack of something. I'm not sure how that's necessarily a problem, that there's not something there. But if a parking lot is dirty or the signage board's not set up the right way, or the pastry case isn't set up the right way, those aren't unimportant things. I'm not suggesting that those things aren't important, but to stop there and to not look then beyond that facade and see how the work is done, and are the beverages being made in a quality way? Are they being made in a standard way for that store team? Is there unnecessary burdensome work? Is it like all of those other things that most people, most leaders have never been taught how to see? I find important. And generally people feel like they're being a good leader by observing these visual cues, but there's so much more depth under the surface of the ocean. I'm going to stick with my cheesy analogy.
That's a good analogy. And I love the 5S thing.
Yeah,
Everybody's looking for a program without
yes.
clarifying the problem to solve. So I'm going to reel you back a little bit here. And this is of particular interest to me of someone who doesn't possess one. But you joined Starbucks as vice president of strategy, and you came out of, as you shared in your career, time with McKinsey, and before that, at Dartmouth, you got your MBA.
Yes.
And I'm curious how initially that, like, obviously you got a lot of learning out of those experiences, and what
Yeah.
that brought you to your role when you joined.
So the Starbucks role initially, just to clarity, I don't want to claim anything that's not true. It was a director role, and then that became vice president
Okay.
of the global enterprise. But for the most part, for the entirety, my McKinsey work was 3 to 6 month engagements that were strategic, what I called strategic problem solving, strategic projects. Some were about cost reduction, some were about long-term future strategy. It just depended on the environment. And what I enjoyed about that was every 3 to 6 months, you got to be exposed to a different problem, a different type of leadership. But I mean, I've always enjoyed problem solving. And so I felt like I was a kid in a candy store. And to that regard, Starbucks was like a full-time client. There were really two aspects to the role. One was strategic problems that were presented to us or requested for us by the leadership team, the senior leadership team or the board. And the other part of the role, which took too long as a process, we tried to shorten it, was leading the company through strategic planning. And so I inherited an existing process for that, which in the first year or two I tried to follow. And then once I felt more comfortable in my role with the company, I started to tweak that. And certainly my exposure to lean, I think, helped benefit that process. But, as an example, I think my first project, which was very kind of McKinsey-ish, was should Starbucks be doing more drive-throughs? At the time, we probably had 15 to 20 drive-through stores. The founder of Starbucks was rightfully nervous, I think, about the different customer experience that would be delivered through a Starbucks drive-through window. It's not nearly as personal. It's more transactional. You talk to someone through a speakerphone. And I went about that in a very McKinsey way with, a small group of people helping me. We did market research. We, talked to a lot of customers that were going through drive-throughs, customers that weren't going through drive-throughs. We looked at the economics of a drive-through store versus non-drive-through stores. We did all that stuff from, again, pick your altitude, 30,000, 50,000 feet, and ended up recommending not just a yes, but hell yes, we should be doing more drive-throughs. And so over the next probably 8 years that I was with the company, Starbucks accelerated drive-throughs significantly, where I think when I left, they were 40% of the store base, but over 60% of the revenue for the US market. They were wildly successful. And that led to another project, which is a drive-through highway project. So, anyways, that's what I learned. That's how I brought it to bear. The strategic planning process initially was really all about kind of numbers, not just financials, but numbers. How many stores, how many new products, revenue from those new products, things like that. And over time, I started shifting our approach to developing those numbers and getting alignment, shifting the approach to try to get more alignment with the organization. and leveraging the people that were closer to the work to influence what those numbers are. At the end of the day, Starbucks and most companies have a set of long-term goals that they've committed to Wall Street. And so in that regard, things aren't very fungible, but there's lots of degrees of freedom as to how you hit those goals. And so trying to figure those things out by leveraging the people who are experts in the organization, as opposed to just saying, here's your number. But over time, as I started learning more about the way the lean world thinks about strategy, and unfortunately, we didn't have your book, Mark, to guide us, but I did read Getting the Right Things Done by Pascal. That influenced me a lot. And so I tried to take that approach in my last year of leading strategic planning and really tried to engage the organization, not just in the what of how many stores are we going to open and how many new products, but how. How are we going to do that? How are we going to figure out which products? How are we going to figure out where the stores are? And asking each leaders to essentially develop their own strategy for their mini business, if you will, and then also, what are the relationships across the organization? Because none of those organizational units operate in a silo. That's one of the challenges, I think, with a lot of organizations. They don't realize that. They get very siloed very quickly. I've worked with a small startup recently, and before they had one store, they were a siloed organization within, no more than 30 people. And they would talk about this department and that department figures that out. Well, what do you mean that department? It's that guy right there. Like, go talk to him. So it's not like there's a magic kind of recipe, at least not that I was taught. And I'm by no means consider myself an expert in strategy, but that's the way I approached the job.
I'm curious. Clearly, you got a lot of value out of that. Your background and experience coming into Starbucks, and then you shared with us a little bit ago this epiphany you had when you're in a store with Jeff Smith. I guess I want to know like what was fundamentally different other than you saw the work. Was there anything else that was impactful and related to that experience based on the background you come from?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think preceding the visit with Jeff, the first foray we had in experimenting with lean thinking was on the problem that I was assigned, which was the company, probably like most retailers, produces a promotional workbook, and a particular promotion had been considered to be a flop by some senior people. And so the question was, well, how did that happen? Why did that happen? And so that was the problem assigned to me. We need to make this promotional process better. And even then, I started getting more engaged with the work and people doing the work. So through a whole bunch of weird connections, we engaged with a gentleman that Jim Womack knew, Guy Parsons, and he came out and led us through an improvement event. And in that, Guy insisted correctly that we engage everyone that's involved in that process. And it was probably 30 people. And it included one token store manager from Eastern Washington.
Crystal.
And Crystal, that's right. And I felt so bad for Crystal, partly because she was by herself. And so that's hard against these, 30 corporate folks. But also, very few people at the corporate headquarters kind of truly valued her thinking. And so we had purposely asked her ahead of time to highlight sections of the most recent workbook that she found valuable. And by the way, at the time, it was a 300-page workbook, one of which came out every 6 to 8 weeks.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I think through a mutual acquaintance, Guy had arranged a very important, telling, informational discussion for us with someone from a major auto company who went through a similar process for their dealer promotions. And they'd spent millions of dollars on the latest glossies and, all this stuff. And the CEO astutely said, let's just invite a couple of the big dealers in and see what they think of this. And so they dumped all the materials out on the table for each of these large dealers and said, we want you to put back in the envelope everything in here that you find valuable, which is how we got the idea to ask Crystal to highlight the workbook. And to their shock and horror, really the only thing that dealers found valuable was the spec sheets with the pricing. And all the other stuff was just not really helpful. And so they spent millions on this program and weren't hitting the mark really on value. And so that I think was very informative for us. And that experience, so we invited these 30 people in and they got to redesign their process. And they took it from 26 weeks. You know, you never want to go from, never is a strong word. It's hard to go from 60 to zero quickly. And so we chose to set a target of half. So we did it half the time, half a year to a quarter of a year. And dramatically fewer pages and a better process and all these things. And so that was a new approach for me in solving problems. That was not a small group of analysts looking at a problem and trying to map something out. And we could have done it that way, and it probably would have taken us a while, but we wouldn't have had nearly a good of an outcome, both because the recommendation would have been vastly different and wouldn't nearly as been well informed, even if we'd gone to talk to all those people and interview them. But it also wouldn't have had this massive organizational alignment that we had around trying, because there was still a lot of change that happened when we walked out of that 3-day event that had to occur to reorganize the organization around this new approach. I learned a lot. I knew really very little about business going into MBA school, and so it was very foundational for me to learn about, all different fronts. And at least at the time, I believe it's still true. Tuck is a very general management kind of approach. So I got to learn about lots of different types, aspects of the business world. And McKinsey just helped accelerate that learning and certainly provided one approach to problem solving. And again, helped me develop this skill that I use today, which is how to think about a problem I've never heard about before and break it down quickly. And maybe not have an answer, by no means have an answer, but at least be able to think about it in a structured way and ask questions. And I think people at Starbucks picked up on that pretty quick. They're like, wow, you can hear about any kind of problem and really digest it quickly. So that's just a capability I was taught at McKinsey that is valuable to me to this day.
So, Scott, you just talked a little bit about some of what other leaders at Starbucks kind of did in participating in this like promotional workbook activity. You also spoke to some of the other leaders and what they recognized in your kind of skill set that you had coming out of the experience with McKinsey, for example. As you were kind of leading the company and leaders into these new approaches, whether that was the kind of new approach that was taken with that promotional workbook, or even the new approach that we ended up taking in the store operations experimentation and the subsequent work, like, I don't know, how were other leaders in the company kind of reacting or responding to these new approaches? They were new to you, but you were also the kind of person responsible for introducing them for others. There's this weird Scott guy who's introducing these foreign methodologies. I can imagine that there were some reactions that you were getting at that time. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. They were all over the gambit. Mostly, I would say, if I had to use one word to categorize it, was skeptical. Because as you're pointing out, it was very foreign. It helped with that first experience that we delivered quite a bit of value. And so then we were being asked for help in other parts of the business with, process improvements. And so there was a bit of a pull, if you will, not so much from senior leaders, but more from kind of mid-level directors who also were, I think, struggling and looking for help. And again, that's part of the role of that strategy group. But there were also definitely some people who just didn't want to learn. That to me is like the key indicator of a leader that I can work with versus one I can't, and weren't interested in trying to kind of understand. I'll never forget, I was with the head of category trying to help her understand, how the work method impacted quality and essentially productivity, and could be a huge lever in increasing sales and quality and customer experience. And in an hour, just 1 hour, tried to, introduce her to this notion of the work and how work improvement can make a dramatic difference. And halfway through, she stopped me and said, looked at her watch and said, what are we doing here? Like, I gotta go. And so that's challenging. I spent probably the better part of 2 years meeting a lot, often at my request in stores to try to simulate, replicate that Smith experience that I had. And some leaders were all for it. But most, I think, were just, this isn't my job kind of thing. I built some alignment to allow me to proceed, but not necessarily alignment to lead, for the leaders to lead on their own and to learn on their own or with us, with support. And then of course, once you feel like you've turned a corner organizationally with a group of leaders, someone announces they're leaving and there's a new person coming in, and that I think started to take its toll on me because I felt like I was just kind of running in mud, so to speak. So it also helped organizationally. I was really set up well for us to learn as a company, I guess I would say. And I don't want to give the impression to anyone that this is just me. I mean, there was a whole team involved, which Josh, you were part of. But, I had the unique role of being responsible for strategic planning and strategic projects, which this clearly was one element of. And I could also influence the strategy through questions and through, just pure force. And I wasn't beholden to any kind of P&L. And so it's not like I was responding to all these crises that a lot of the leaders were. And I had support from our CEO at the time. And so you put all those things together and we were free to experiment. We were allowed and given budget to experiment in Portland. We were then allowed and given budget to do this workbook thing. We were allowed to do other experiments. And because of my role in reporting to the CEO at the time, that afforded me quite a bit of influence. And so it's super helpful.
So there's going to be some, other people in leadership positions similar to the one that you've been talking about that will listen to this.
Yep.
That may themselves, be early or, in some clear kind of phase of learning, like their own learning, and separately are likely in situations with peers and colleagues, other leaders, other executives that too are learning a lot or confronting these new ideas and kind of having to process them in certain ways. I mean, is there anything that you maybe coming out of your experience with Starbucks, or I know you've worked with many other leadership teams in the time since, but just maybe some sort of like advice or tips for leaders who themselves are in a phase of learning, an intensive phase of learning, maybe kind of early learning about this stuff. So for their own sake, but then also as they're engaging with others who are confronting these ideas, are also early in learning how to, kind of how to go through that, how to be a good learner and be a good influencer of others or supporter of others, other leaders who are learning.
Yeah, so I guess I would say two things. One is spend more time where the work happens. And that can be tough challenging as a leader because people will definitely operate differently. They feel more judged. I actually started working in my local store as a barista so I could get to know the work. I could try some new work procedures that we might be experimenting with in my local store. Try to do it for, a couple hours every week at least. And so that's helpful if you start to get to know the team a little bit. But that, depending on your organization, that may not get you to all the areas. And so I always would introduce myself to folks on the front lines as someone who's trying to learn more about what's happening, not to judge. And I want to know about problems and things like that. And generally, that kind of introduction can create an entryway for you to just sit there and observe. But if you don't know what to look for, if you're just kind of casually observing, as I had been before that visit with Jeff Smith, that time may not be appropriate. And so you need to, have someone teach you what to look for, and how to observe and how to work. So that's one thing. Just spend more time where the work happens, engaging team members in the problems and the struggles they have. And I think LEI probably has a couple of resources on what to go look for. I know John and I recorded a podcast at one point on that. The second thing is, and this is hard for me to this day, but turning off the problem solving that's going on in your brain as you talk to someone, and instead turn on this aspect of your brain, which is how can I ask questions that will help this person learn whatever it is they're focused on. So instead of trying to solve the problem for them, how to ask questions to learn from them about what they're learning and what they're doing, and ask questions that will help them become a better problem solver. And that's probably one of my biggest shifts is I've gone from this world of MBA and case studies and then McKinsey of being the problem solver and the idea generator to actually someone who wants to develop that capability in others. So when I do work with a client, I'm almost always trying to build their capability as opposed to just say, here's the answer. And I've come to realize that's importantly for two reasons. One, I feel like I can have a much bigger impact if I can influence that person and develop them. And I don't know nearly as much as they do about their work environment. And so for me to come in from the outside and say, oh, I can see all these things and here's what you need to do. Like, I have no idea. I don't know about the culture. I don't know about what's been tried before. I mean, there's so many things that I don't have visibility to. And so to develop that capability in others and to create improvement by supporting others, I think is a really important capability for leaders. And, one of the experiments I did myself during my time at Starbucks after this visit with Jeff Smith and after spending a lot of time in stores, because I wanted to learn, how to lead this way, but also if these changes that we were contemplating were as impactful as I was thinking they were, both in terms of store performance, but also in terms of people performance. I finagled my way into a 2-week experiment in a store in Northern California. And through that experience, I worked to develop the store manager and the district manager's capability of improving work. And the district manager learned a lot about how to engage their team of store managers in problem solving. Like that for her was the big learning. Like, why am I trying to solve all their problems? They all have different problems. And so she started leading in a very different way. And initially, she started describing it to her boss and peers as, I'm a lean leader. And they started asking questions. And then there were people skeptical and people that, felt threatened by that. Some of her peers who would come visit her and say, oh, this is, nothing special and blah, blah, blah. And so she just stopped talking about it as a lean way, as just, this is the way I lead. And the shift was she'd get together as an example with her store managers, instead of saying, okay, here's what you all need to do this next 2 weeks or next month. She would get together with her store managers and say, okay, I want you each to identify a problem you're having in your stores and how to solve that. And next time we get together, we're going to learn more about how you address that problem. And she ended up becoming that year. She became district manager of a quarter, of the fourth quarter, I think it was. And it wasn't, it's just she showed up in a very different way. She didn't try to solve their problems. She tried to build that problem solving capability in their team. And it was, for people that reported to her, it was like, this is amazing. Like, I feel valued. I own my business. Like, it's all the things they teach you in management school that you want in a leader. Not necessarily how to teach them.
So, Scott, I want to follow that up.
Yeah.
You just went through some really important points there, and I want to try to summarize them a little bit for our listeners. Sure. I think to me, what I heard, there's this organizational dynamic that exists that, in a way, keeps leaders to some extent from work.
Yes.
I think and I think that's often created. I see that in an organization I'm with now, that's created by the leader doesn't necessarily know how to go towards the work.
Yep.
and it's a big deal when they come. Like when a lead, if you know the CEO or someone like Scott is going to come and see my store, I mean that's all of a sudden becomes like this really big deal, and so
That's right.
it becomes more of a production or a show. So I think what you described to me that like there was like I heard three barriers to overcome, to climb over for
Okay.
leaders. And I think
Yeah.
this is mostly about like from the leader side.
Yeah.
And that is, you said spend more time at the work.
Yep.
And so that means very specifically where the like the work of like serving the in Starbucks serving the customer is. And so that means like, okay, I have to go out and do that. But when I do that, there's this like big dynamic that's created that all of a sudden the big guys coming to see us. So
Yes.
I think the organization needs to get over that, and the leaders do. I think the
Yes.
second thing you talked about was, okay, I can go there, but what am I looking at?
Yes.
And I think that requires, like you had the fortune of having a coach to help you see things, maybe put on a different set of glasses to see.
Yes.
And then the third thing you addressed in depth was like, okay, what's your approach when you're there? How do you like engage with people, ask questions to draw out learning, and so I think I got a lot out of what you just said, and I tried to summarize it there. Was
Okay.
that
Yeah. I think those are exactly the right three things. Like I think about the first one you talked about. In some organizations like Starbucks, not having it be a big deal is easier, unlike Starbucks. So, with 8,000 US stores, you're never going to make it routine for an executive to come visit your store.
right?
And so that becomes harder. If you only have, a handful, 5 to 10 to 20 manufacturing sites, well, okay, now I show up, once a month at each one, and it starts to become a little normal, a little more normal, maybe. I don't think there's a retailer in the country, based on my experience at Starbucks and other experiences, where an executive tour is scheduled and there isn't, if not tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars put into the improvement of the facilities of those places being visited. And the question I always asked is, we're spending all this money because executives are coming. Why didn't we spend that money when all the customers are coming? Like, it's good enough for the customers, but it's not good enough for the executives. Like, that never makes, and that's not a Starbucks thing. That's a retailer thing, and maybe that's a company thing. I don't know, but certainly from a retailer perspective, I visited a small shop a month ago, and sure enough, there was new pine bark. Now, maybe it was just a season. Maybe it was just a season, but I don't think so. And it would surprise me if there wasn't a new paint job and a whole bunch of other things.
I do think it's pretty unique in that retail environment. I mean, even like I spent hours, days, years in stores, and even the intensity of like a district manager visit.
Yes,
I mean,
yes,
your boss who just doesn't work in that space, right? Like they come by on occasion. The district manager only oversees 10 stores. I mean, you're going to see them every couple of weeks, but it's still just an unusual thing. So any leadership, I mean, if that's how you experience your district manager coming around, tenfold, your director above that, your vice president above that, your CEO above that. I mean, it just may be like a once in a career kind of experience. And I remember when I, coming to LEI, getting the opportunity to spend time in manufacturing environments or factories. I mean, so many levels of management leadership are just present in that facility,
yes,
interacting with people all the time, knowing them by
yes.
first names. I mean,
It
it
is.
creates a completely different culture and dynamic that anyway, people listening might be in one or the other or sort of somewhere along that spectrum. But anyway, kind of recognizing what's the environment you're in regarding kind of leadership, getting close to the work, and how to account for that. It is very, very different company to
Yeah.
company, and in this case we're talking high level retail to manufacturing or whatever. But
Yeah, and Mark, maybe a fourth aspect is for leaders of leaders. So you talked about company environments that almost organizations or cultures maybe that make this hard. There is an expectation on senior leaders, most companies I'm with, I see that you are actually in the corporate headquarters. That's your job, and you're in meetings all day. That's your job. And so if you're a leader of leaders, I would encourage you to try to shift that. It doesn't have to, you don't have to shift it a huge amount, just a little bit, like a half day a week or one day a month, or I mean, to start. There's an expectation now that you're not in the headquarters, that you're out seeing where work is happening, that you have some responsibility for. I never forget, I worked a fair amount with the IT team at Starbucks, and I heard on one hand from the IT team that our networks at stores were always up and operational and connected. I heard a different story when I talked to store managers who told me, oh my God, every Monday at blah, blah, blah time when everyone's processing payroll, the whole, it always goes down, Scott. So I made a point once when I met with that IT director that oversaw this of meeting in the stores. And he picked a store, not me. It was not like a setup. And the store manager recognized we were there from corporate and came over and offered us, sample food and all these other things that they do. And we appreciated it. But then I just casually asked, hey, tell me about the uptime on your network. And sure enough, it's what I expected, which is, usually it's fine, but on Mondays at 4 o'clock, it's horrible. And so even that, like, get out in stores and ask questions, not because you're trying to prove a point and make yourself look good. You're trying to discover problems that store teams have, in our case, store teams, frontline team members have that make their job harder. That in my mind is what a great leader does. How do I figure out where issues are happening that I'm not going to solve them, but I'm at least become aware of them so I can have someone else be responsible for figuring out what's going on, and then we can lead to a better outcome.
I want to hit maybe something we've touched on a couple of times. One more time before I get into just like a wrap up question or two, which would be, so you've spoken to some experiences with some of your colleagues, some of the other leaders in trying to, I don't know, pitch them on lean, so to speak, or even just share some of what you were learning. I guess from those experiences, would you have like an elevator pitch, or would you have something that has really been consistently effective, or at least door opening with leaders that you could kind of share with us and equip our leaders with as they engage with other leaders in their organization?
This is the area I've struggled with the most. How to engage a senior leader so that they want to learn. And I've tried lots of different approaches, I think, but I often find I'm not super successful at this. And it's hard. So my elevator pitch is about recognizing that not all challenges and opportunities can be pursued from corporate, and that you need to engage people. One of the things I heard John Shook talk about recently was his assertion, I guess, that expecting teams to do some kind of problem solving without equipping them on how to do that problem solving is actually disrespectful. And that really hit home for me. And I don't know, there are a lot of leaders that talk about how their employees are one of their most important priorities. And, you hear some people talk about them as assets. But I find that set of actions that lives that life isn't necessarily followed. And so trying to help people bridge that gap is what I've been trying to do. But I've struggled at it. I have struggled at it.
I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I think everyone listening struggles with it too. And to sort of like pretend otherwise, or to even believe that, Scott Heydon has found the silver bullet, or John.
Yeah, when if someone finds it, send me a note. Like,
I mean, I think in the position that I'm in, getting to be a part of the Lean Enterprise Institute, interact with so many leaders throughout the community that we get to interact with, I don't think it's out there. But to share what you do, and perhaps that'll be similar or different than what others are doing, to sort of incorporate into their own experimentation, just like you're continuing to experiment with ways of doing it, I think is great. So thanks for being.
Yeah, and I do think it's a combination of approach and person. And so I mentioned earlier that people that are curious, I think, are more open. to it that want to learn. And so generally, I try to ask questions to get them thinking so that after I'm out of that office or meeting room or wherever it is, they're driving home and they're thinking, wow, I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. And how can I figure it out? But that requires both of those things. It requires someone asking the right questions, which I may or may not always have, and then also someone who's able to actually be a little introspective and wants to learn and is curious.
I recognize John Shook's influence in that answer, right? To give away his game, maybe to people who've experienced visits with John or may experience visits with John in the future. He told me one time that throughout an entire visit, he's constantly thinking to himself, what will be the
Yes.
question that I'm going to leave these guys with?
Yes.
From the beginning of the day.
Yes.
He's
Before he shows up.
Before he even shows up, that's right.
Yeah.
He's formulating
That's right.
that closing question.
Yes. I will say this. Virtually all of my learning, I would say 90% has happened through experiences. And I've actually thought about my learning from John because, when John introduced me to Jeff taught me stuff that John never introduced to me, even though, I'd known John at that point for probably 3 or 4 months. But most of my learnings with John happened through a set of experiences that, he initiated, whether it's visiting an auto plant, which helped me realize how simple Starbucks operations are. Oh my God. And at the time, I thought we were incredibly complex. It's so hard. Like you just go to any manufacturing site, and, like that's so simple. To a visit to a retail store in New York City that operates in a totally different way. B&H Photo, go check it out. It's awesome.
I went
Almost
there with
all
you.
of
No,
what's that?
you recommended I go there, Scott. That's right. And I
It
went.
is incredible, and every time
I
I
just
go, it's
walked by
different.
there last week. It's still running.
Yeah, I would love to do a case study on that. I thought often I haven't acted on it yet of reaching out to their leadership, asking to do a case study. Anyways, so experiences can be really powerful, and so often if I get more time, I will ask people to go through experiences and try to get them to learn. And that often, the other thing I think you're trying to do as a coach is understand where your learner is at in their thinking, so that you can ask the right questions, right? And so if someone shows up at B&H Photo, per se, and walks out and says, yeah, it's just a normal retail store. Like, okay, that tells you something about them. If they walk out and say, wow, that was really different. I'm just starting to process all that. Those are two different reactions that a coach can adapt to, depending on, and tailor their questions.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It was a very good conversation. One final question to close us out, Scott. What's sort of energizing you these days? What are you maybe learning about? What challenges are you working on?
I'm trying to pursue projects that, again, give me different experiences, different environments, which might be different cultures, different settings, but also people that I enjoy working with. And I just want to continue to learn more about how to coach others in problem solving and build capability. For me, that's what kind of is what I've been passionate about all along, how to create problem solvers. Even almost first day John showed up at Starbucks, that's where our focus was. And I think it's a good lifelong pursuit, building others' capabilities. And I would like to say I'm super proud of people like you, Josh, that have taken that learning and capitalized on it immensely, and learned yourself. And now here you are, CEO of LEI. It's awesome.
I was gonna say, as someone who has learned a lot about problem solving from you, and there's many others that I know personally, and that anyway, we're very grateful that that's been your career pursuit, if not life pursuit. So, thanks for that, Scott. Thanks for joining us. This was an awesome conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.